I want to thank you all for coming out for what should be a very lively program. It certainly is in the context of what we're doing this year in terms of Lest We Forget. It's a theme that we have. It's on the banner outside. Lest we forget the things that brought us into this period that we have right now that has been foreshadowed by events that happened in the past. I'm thrilled that Mary Elliott is here because I was a 19th century history major, and I tend to look at the world through that period. So you will see, and you've seen people come here. We've done stuff on the exhibitions on the abolitionists. We've had scholars, historians from Sam Houston State, from Rice. I think it's a period that is well worth looking at over and over again. And we're delighted tonight to have somebody who is a specialist in that period. Mary Elliott, of course, is a museum specialist with the National African American Museum of History and Culture. She was very prominent in the Slavery and Freedom exhibition that's up now. She's got a nice DC background because she went to Howard. Amen. Which, you know, for somebody who went to Baltimore, school in Baltimore, you go to Howard and it was happening, except for the Punch-Out. And the Punch-Out was a place that, you know, people would go there, and there was a reason we'd always say they called it the Punch-Out, because if you spent all your time there, you would spend maybe a year and you'd have punched out. But the rest of it is, it's a wonderful institution, and then she stayed in Washington, D.C. and got a law degree from Catholic University's Columbus Law School. And anybody who's been to Washington, D.C. knows that, you know, there's so many great universities there, and Catholic is one of them. I like the history department. She liked the law school. Since then, she has been a consultant on American history, African American history, and specifically on certain areas, the ones that I'm most interested in as well. Antebellum South, Reconstruction, slavery reconstruction, etc. And she goes all the way up to Jim Crow. Now, the final thing I'll say about her is that I make the point of saying a lot these days that Texas and Florida are the new Mississippi and Alabamas. And so as it turns out, I think Mary's talk today won't be specifically about Texas, but it will be about Texas in the sense that Mississippi, and it's so ironic because I just say we're that again. If you look at Mississippi, then you're really looking at Texas even now. So with no further ado, I bring Mary Elliott in. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Good evening.
Good evening.
I want to make sure I know how to use this. There we go. Okay. Well, thank you for that very nice introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I had the pleasure of doing a presentation this morning or this afternoon at the Gregory School. And as you heard, I work with the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I'm the curator for Slavery and Freedom. I was honored to be able to co-curate the Slavery and Freedom exhibition in the museum. And I do lots of work, not just curating, but also writing, publishing, public programs, and more. I have a project going on in St. Croix and also in Mobile, Alabama with Africatown, the historic community that was born out of those who survived the crossover, the Atlantic from Benin to Mobile, Alabama during the illegal slave trade. So today I want to talk to you about really African Americans' Reconstruction and the Black vote. I, again, as I mentioned, work at the museum. We've been open since 2016. It was an idea that came into being around 1916, brought up by several African American men who formerly fought with the U.S. colored troops. And they thought that it was necessary to have a monument dedicated to African Americans and their contributions to the nation in terms of the military. And so it took 100 years for this to come into being. And since we've opened, we've had about 7 million visitors. This is an image of the inside of the history galleries. On the lower floor, you have the Slavery and Freedom exhibition. Here you have the segregation exhibition, and then just above here is the Changing America, which looks at what happened after Martin Luther King was assassinated through to today. What you see here is where people queue up to go downstairs and start at the bottom. The history gallery is foundational to the rest of the museum. I want to point out to you here this slave cabin. The slave cabin came from Edisto Island, South Carolina, and on the front we interpret it in terms of slavery and freedom. But on the back we interpret it in terms of freedom, emancipation, and Reconstruction period. This whole wall here is a wall of all these pieces of legislation that helped define the nation. At the heart of all those pieces of legislation was slavery, all the way from the Declaration of Independence through the Reconstruction Amendments. And so we look at the back side of the cabin and we talk about the fact that once freedom came, you had a choice. You either signed a contract as a sharecropper or you tried to get on with your life and make a way. And if you did so, at that time, 1866, the black codes went into play. Those black codes defined us as vagrants if we were not out back in those fields, living in those same slave cabins, signed onto a contract in another form of slavery. So we look at that and we look at the Reconstruction Amendments. But I want you to keep in mind, underneath this rail car, we have the story of the domestic slave trade. The domestic slave trade, two of the most successful dealers during the time were Isaac Franklin and John Armfield. Isaac Franklin took his profit, turned it into power, and bought 8 plantations. Of those 8 plantations, several were in Louisiana. Now, you come up to the top and you see this segregated rail car. And you think about this. If you are someone trying to get on with your life and you're not signed on to a sharecropper contract, you become a vagrant. You're then pulled and you're placed into these prisons and placed back out into the fields as convict leased labor. So you have this guard tower from Angola Prison. Angola Prison is on the site of former Angola Plantation. Angola Plantation was formerly owned by Isaac Franklin. And so it gets us from slavery and freedom to the convict leased labor system. We have a prison cell from that same prison, one of the worst prisons in the nation. And that prison cell is upstairs in our community gallery, and that allows us to talk about the prison industrial complex. The point is that all of this is connected. We don't talk about this history in a vacuum. So this is the Slavery and Freedom exhibition, the opening of it, and one of the things that stands out is John Hope Franklin, the renowned scholar, said, "We've got to tell the unvarnished truth." Those were his exact words to our founding director, Lonnie Bunch. I can tell you that people go through this exhibition and they read every label. People stay in our museum for 6 hours. The norm to stay in a museum is about 2 hours, and it's black, it's white, it's young, it's old, it's everyone. So what brought me to all of this, and why am I talking about voting and African Americans? This is an image in Oklahoma of educators. There's a man in this photo right here. That's my grandfather.
See there?
He's the only black man in that room. He was the principal of Carver Junior High School in Enid, Oklahoma. He was the principal of Booker T. Washington High School in Sapulpa, Oklahoma. And I remember I wondered what was it like for him when I'd look through these pictures and see this one black man amongst all these white people. What was life like for him? This is a picture of my mother. We moved from Oklahoma City to Washington, D.C. One of the last communities to integrate was Glen Echo, Maryland. She was the only black woman in that scene. Why? Because this was the holiday party at the school my sister attended. My mother actually moved us from Glen Echo with my dad to Silver Spring, Maryland, because she said your sister was the only black student in the entire school. And so we moved to an integrated community. And then this picture is of my great-grandmother. That's Maggie Barnes. Maggie Barnes was a sharecropper in Shiro, Texas, just outside of Huntsville. Right down the street from a community called Mount Zion Settlement. It's not even on the map. And so I always wondered when I looked at these pictures, what's your story, which in fact is my story too. So I started to dig, and I found this person, John Gandy. John Gandy was the first cousin to my great-grandfather. John Gandy was the president of Virginia State University from 1914 until the 1940s. He had an unpublished autobiography held in the archives at Virginia State University. And in it, he wrote, "This is where I was born. My mother was this woman. Her sister was this woman. Her mother was this woman. They were owned by this man and this woman. Colonel Adley Hogan Gladden gave my mother, her sister, and her mother to his brother-in-law, Thomas Watt. He then carried them directly from South Carolina to Oktibbeha County, Mississippi. This is the location of Mississippi State University." So I wondered, well, where is this place? I've never heard of it. All I've heard about is Oklahoma. And so my mother and I took his unpublished autobiography, we didn't know anyone, and we flew into Mississippi. We rode up to a gas station in Oktibbeha County, and we said to ourselves, the first black person we see, we're going to ask them where this is. And this woman pulled up with her daughter, and she said, "Follow me, I'll show you." We rode past Mississippi State University. There was a fork in the road. She said, "You can go either way. You'll come full circle." When we cleared the trees, it was open spaces. You could tell where all the plantations were. We ended up finding plantations, churches, schools, all the sites that he mentioned in his unpublished autobiography. This again is John Gandy. This is his mother, this is his father, and this is Colonel Adley Hogan Gladden, who owned them. And this is his wife. So I did more research, and I looked up and I found out about the gallant Gladden. He fought in the Civil War and died at the Battle of Shiloh. And he owned this woman, who is my great-great-grandmother's sister. I've never seen my great-great-grandmother, but now at least I know what she kind of looked like because he described her. This is her husband, Horace Gandy. Now this is important. In Mississippi and Oktibbeha County, not unlike in all these other counties across the nation, black people were fighting to maintain their rights that they acquired at the time of Reconstruction. 13th Amendment, the end of slavery. 14th Amendment, the right to citizenship and due process. And 15th Amendment, the right to vote and hold office. They battled the white community at every turn. If you think that we sat down and let life happen to us, we did not. And this man was one of the ringleaders, as one might call him, who was constantly in battle. This is Judge Thomas Carroll. He was a Reconstruction-era judge. Gandy wrote about the events in Oktibbeha County, Mississippi. So did Judge Carroll. Judge Carroll wrote very unapologetically. He wrote about, well, we caught up with this nigger, we lynched him, we killed this carpetbagger, we stuffed the ballot boxes, we ran them off. That was his version of everything, although we know that many people were killed. But we also know through other accounts how black people fought to maintain that right to vote and to hold office. Again, Oktibbeha County, human suffering and the power of the human spirit. On this map, you'll see all of these sites. It's hard for you to read, but there is a church here. It's Chapel Hill Church. When my mother and I went to Mississippi, we drove through and we saw Chapel Hill Road. John Gandy said, "I hated going to Chapel Hill Church because when it snowed, I had to climb up that hill and it would get iced over and I could never quite get up the hill in time for school." When we drove down Chapel Hill Road, I looked to my right and there was this hill. And at the top was a church. And at the top was the church sign. And on the church sign was a bell. We rode over to the church. I jumped out of the car. The deacon came out. He said, "How can I help you?" And I told him the story. He said, "Well, yeah, this is the original church. The only thing we did was put brick on the outside and industrial carpeting down. And that bell, that's from the original school." That was 2004. 2005, we ended up taking the family back and told them the story. They couldn't get enough of it. This is an account from the Senate record where they actually did testimonies of people who witnessed all of these battles between black men and white men, enforcing their right to vote. It says, Wednesday was the appointed day for a radical meeting at Artesia. This is in that same area of Oktibbeha County, literally 5 minutes in the next county over. And Frazee and Whitfield were the orators. Negroes came from everywhere, came with all pomp and circumstance of glories, war, in cavalcades, mounted on muleback chiefly. They came then in different and distinct bands from different directions. When 2 or 3 bands got upon the ground, a line was formed and a dead line established, and the announcement made that it was death to cross it until the speaking was over. Officers with drawn swords walked up and down the line and straightened it and put it in military precision. The whites of Artesia are few in number, and we will not insult them by insinuating that they were intimidated, but we'll say they were cautious and prudent, and telegraphed to Columbus the situation and asked for a company of United States troops stationed there to come to keep the peace. Now you picture in your mind all these black men riding in from each corner on horseback. Now what I did read to you is there's another account of this where they came through banging drums, carrying guns, enforcing their right to vote. This was a regular thing. They banged drums and carried guns. There are other accounts that say the banging went on for nights at a time, and the white people wanted it to stop. And they knew that the black people were calling each other out to vote, to enforce that right. So an ordinance went in place to prevent people from selling drums to black men and from selling ammunition. Now we're talking about Mississippi, but this was all over. This is a testimony from Henry Adams, who actually testified before Congress, and he talked about, now think about Freedmanstown. People came from East Texas, they came from Galveston, they came from Louisiana. This man is talking that in 1870, they formed a group called the Committee. The Committee had about 500 men that they then shipped out all over the nation to find the best place where black people could live. He says, a parcel of us got together and said that we would organize ourselves into a committee and look into affairs and see the true condition of our race, to see whether it was possible we could stay under a people who had held us under bondage or not. Then we did so and organized a committee. What the interviewer asked him was, what did you call this committee? And he said, the Committee. And they were in existence from 1870 to 1874. We worked, some of us, our way from place to place and went from state to state. And some of them did amongst our people in the fields. They worked amongst people in the fields everywhere to see what life was like. But here's the thing he said, and they continued on until 1874. Some of them stated, speaking about some of the men who were shipped out to these different sites, some of them stated in parts of the country where they voted, they would be shot. Some of them stated that if they voted the Democratic ticket, they would not be injured. Well, for those of you who don't know, but I trust everyone here is well aware, that the Republican Party and Democratic Party from that time are now switched. And so, of course, if you voted Republican, you could get shot. But if you voted Democrat, you were good. So as I kept digging, one thing that came to mind was that my family was friends with Booker T. Washington, and they were part of the National Negro Business League. What was interesting to me is, just like Henry Adams spoke about this collective of people that formed the Committee, there were these kinship networks that were formed within the framework of slavery. All of us are here tonight. Some of us know each other, some of us will meet each other tonight. But one thing is for sure, we know how to work a net. And so we do that. Back then, we did it truly as a form of survival, right? And so here, the National Negro Business League had men and women all over the nation. That network was vast, and they used the nation as their chessboard to try and move the race forward and to survive. These are some of the men, Booker T. Washington here, and Emmett Scott here. Emmett Scott played a pivotal role, knowing where everyone was all around the nation, involved in communication. When you do your own research, the one thing I'll emphasize to you is be sure to look at the letterhead. Look at the letterhead and see who's on the executive committees. See who's on the church board. See who's on the usher board. See where people have crossed paths with each other. You might find out, wow, our families actually knew each other back in the day. There's a reason why I call this person auntie even though they're not blood related. That was also a form of survival. Very important. Churches in conversation with each other. Educators in conversation with each other as a form of survival. In this case, it was under the umbrella of the National Negro Business League, which included the national retailers, the national bankers, the national morticians. All of these different groups came under that one umbrella, and they were strategic. This is T.J. Elliott. T.J. Elliott is my great-grandfather's brother. He was a member of the National Negro Business League. He was the head of the Oklahoma State Negro Business League. And he owned a chain of department stores, a hotel, a bank, a theater, as well as 300 acres of land with my great-grandfather. This is the inside of that store, if you can see. Here is a white man purchasing some goods from that store. They had the exclusive right to sell Stetson hats in that part of the state. Their patrons were black, white, and Native American. I found this information in the Booker T. Washington Manuscript Collection, and I'm sharing this with you because as you do your own research, look under every stone, because you might find stuff that you think, I'll never find it because everyone's deceased. You'd be surprised where you'll find information. I wanted to share this with you because what are all of the different pillars that we use to stand upon, to uphold our communities, to be able to go out in the streets and enforce our right to vote? Self-sustaining black businesses, leadership roles, civic engagement, organizing, education, and faith. This is my Aunt Lucy, my Uncle Ned, and his wife Edna Mae Bailey. All three of them were merchants. All three of them were civically engaged. All three of them helped build churches and schools. This man, along with several other men, had this group called the 20 Gents. And in the theater, they would invite children to come and watch films, and at the end of the film, they would give them a bag of oranges and dimes, and that was their gift to represent these black men who used their power for good. And this is a picture of my great-great-grandfather. He's formerly enslaved, and so was his wife. But you look at this picture. All of these men are proud black men, including this one who suffered through life looking white, stood out like a sore thumb amongst all of his family. This man is that man. But look at how they all surround this man formerly enslaved. And you look at his stance. You can only imagine what his life was like. But these men were very proud to claim relationship with this man. If it weren't for him, they probably wouldn't have been here, right? This man and this man were part of that fight in Mississippi. They ultimately killed some Klan members in 1890, left Mississippi, and went to Indian Territory, which became Oklahoma, in 1907. They also formed a delegation in 1905 to make Indian Territory the first all-black state. Of course, it became Oklahoma in 1907, and the first laws on the books were the segregation laws. So we get to this, casting the first ballot. Voting matters, and it matters how we make sure that it takes place. And it's not just voting, it's doing voter education, because today we don't have any kind of civic education in school. And so here we have this image of the Harper's Weekly image, which is well known, of casting the first ballot. I'll have to get you the source for this, but this is from, it's from Friedman's area, and it's shown as casting the first vote. But I'll get you the source for that. So I thought it was really important to include that. And of course, there were all of these illustrations about the violence that went on. You'll see illustrations like this where people were approached at the polling sites, they were threatened, and oftentimes many people were killed. And then you also see some of these images that show not only African Americans, but you see some of the Irish people that were also treated the same way. And I find that very important because we talk about just our experiences, but it's a nuanced thing, and I think it's important for us to understand this shared history. From Texas, we have this gentleman who was one of the first delegates for the 1868 to 1869 Constitutional Convention. We have Matthew, it should say Gaines. He was pivotal in helping to make sure that Prairie View A&M came into being. And then, of course, we have Barbara Jordan and Mickey Leland. I wanted to, of course, tip my hat to Mickey Leland because he was pivotal into making sure that our museum came into being. So why does this matter? Well, so you have Freedmanstown, very important, powerful history, just like in D.C., Black Wall Street, right? Just like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street. In D.C., it's Black Broadway. You have Africatown in Mobile, Alabama. You have Weeksville in New York. Well, here, this is where we got the slave cabin from Edisto Island, South Carolina, that one you saw in the earlier picture. We took that slave cabin apart piece by piece, conserved it, restored it, and built it up right back in the museum for everyone to see. Well, Well, how did we even get that cabin? Because of this woman. She was over the Edisto Island Historic Preservation Society. Gretchen and I have become very close, and Gretchen is the one who called me and said, I heard you're looking for a slave cabin, and we have one. The Historical Society had that slave cabin. It was given to them, and they couldn't maintain it. They didn't have the money. And they said, there's no reason for this to go to the wayside. The nation needs to know this story. So they said, please come and take this cabin. And so they gave it to us as a donation, and this is Gretchen standing here with the descendants of the people who were enslaved in that cabin. This young lady here, really powerful story. I didn't tell this afternoon, but I should share with you, beautiful young woman. You see her beautiful brown skin, right? She had piercing blue eyes. And there was a woman on the cabin committee for the Historical Society, same figure, same blue eyes. And she said to me, Arlene said, Mary, Carol wants to talk to me, and I don't want to talk to her. She keeps telling me we're related. I don't want to hear that. And I said, well, Arlene, I tell you what, I suggest you talk to her because she probably has more information on your family that you need, that you don't even know is out there. Next thing I know, here they come running down the road in this truck, dirt flying everywhere. Arlene gets out. She has this shocked look on her face. I said, what happened? She said, well, Carol took me to her house. And I'd been to Carol's house. It looks like a plantation house. She said, Carol took me to her house and said, so tell me about your side of the family. And Arlene said, well, my brother's writing a book about it. And Carol said, that's all right. You just let me know when the book's done. For now, here. And she threw a book at her. She had already written about the other half of the family. She said, this is the other half of your family. She said, I want to get to know all about us. And they sat and had a glass of wine. In the end, Arlene ended up getting cancer. She died a few months before we opened the museum. She became best friends with Carol, and Carol was there till the day she died. And as of last week, her brother published his book. And so they are now working to restore a lot of the site down in Edisto Island, South Carolina. These women lived in some of those cabins that existed along that row. There were about 10 cabins that existed along the row. This one was lived in. It was built in the 1850s, lived in until about 1981. No running water, no heat, no electricity. Remember this woman's face, Miss Emily Meggett. I love her to death. She had me at her house and told me when I landed and got off the plane, well, I have a snack for you. And the snack was fried shrimp, red rice, beans, cornbread, potato salad. I said, well, this is a snack. I don't know what dinner's going to be like. And so she is known as the woman in the community that everyone loves, Ms. Meggett. Now, here's the thing that's interesting, is how do opportunities like this, where we do preservation and we talk about these themes like voting and black resistance and the experiences that we went through violence and just trying to uphold our rights, how do we use these opportunities to talk about race, right? So I met all these people on Edisto Island. They're wonderful, a wonderful white community. There is a shared history. Everyone takes ownership of this history. They love Ms. Meggett. This one woman who comes, very wealthy woman, beautiful home. They have a home in Edisto Island, in New York, in Japan, all over. She said, I don't know what I would do without Miss Emily. And you know, she came over to bake her famous caramel cakes, and she looked at my stove and said, well, you can't use this stove. This stove is no good. I have to turn the heat up and adjust it all the time. And she said, and I turned around and I just went out and bought a brand new gourmet stove just for Miss Emily. And you know what I thought to myself? Well, you all love Miss Emily, and you say you don't know what you would do without her. So while she was raising your kids, feeding them, clothing them, doing the laundry, cleaning the house, did any one of you think to say, hey, let's see how we can get you to start a business? And then while you start your business, you can train the next generation of domestic workers who are also entrepreneurs. So that way you don't have to worry about when Miss Emily's gone, and that way some of those young people will have jobs and they can put their own kids through school. Those are the types of conversations to be had. When I went down to Edisto Island and I did a presentation, I told them I'm not going to sugarcoat any of this, and I didn't. And the church that I went to was the church that was attended by the majority of the slaveholding families. The people at that church, it was standing room only, they were predominantly white. If you think no one wants to talk about this history, you're wrong. By the time I was done with my presentation, they gave me a standing ovation. These were all white people, and I did not sugarcoat it. This gentleman is one of those folks. His name is John Giroux, and this ties everything together. So you have Freedmanstown, this beautiful community Not unlike what we talked about with these people who left Mississippi and went to Indian Territory. You have places like Edisto Island. Edisto Island is the site of the original story of 40 Acres and a Mule. So, Edisto Island, all these slaveholders left, and as a result, all the enslaved in that community said, look, we shed our blood, sweat, and tears for this land. We deserve it. So the government gave them the land 3 times and took it away 3 times. But there was a group of 9 black men who formed a co-op, and they were able to successfully hold on to 900 acres of land and form a community. One of those men is this man here, Henry Hutchinson. He ultimately built this house on that land. He designed it and built it for his wife. This is from that Reconstruction period. It's been in the family all these years, including one of the descendants, Arlene. This is part of her family history. It's literally 3 minutes down the road from where the slave cabin is. When the family realized we can't afford to take care of this house, this man stepped in. He's over the Edisto Island Land Trust. He stepped in and he said, I'm going to help out. They were able to acquire all the land in the house. He works directly with the descendants, and they are now restoring this house to its original state. They're going to use this house as a site for education. Why does this matter? Because places like Freedmanstown, that's your house. So it matters to restore this history and make sure that people always know this history. These are some of the men who were working. You see they have the scaffolding over the house. They're working, looking at how they can preserve this history the proper way, make sure they follow all the requirements so that it meets the standards for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And guess who's right here cooking the fried chicken for them? Ms. Emily. Now, I'll tell you, when I left her home, she also made sure that I traveled home with some homemade wine. She's really good. And so this is a picture of the descendant community along with all of the volunteers that are working tirelessly to restore this home, to bring this history back to life so people will never forget the strength, the power, the resistance, the resilience of all of these African Americans who survived slavery and went on to make sure that we could follow through on our rights as citizens, as free citizens enabled to vote and hold office. So I shared this today earlier. While I'm here and I'm excited to be here to share this information, what really brought me to Houston is my mother's family had their first gathering. And so this is my great-great-grandmother who I mentioned earlier. That's Maggie Barnes. Maggie Barnes is from Shiro, Texas, as I mentioned. She was a domestic worker and a sharecropper. Maggie Barnes was raped by 3 different men, 2 brothers and a cousin. One brother, the result of that was my great-grandmother. Another brother was her brother, Ed, was the result of that. And then another brother was her other brother, who was the result of the rape by the cousin. She was a sharecropper, got married at 14 years old, ultimately moved to Houston. And she had her daughter, which is my grandmother, Rosa Mae Rogers, Rosa Mae Bullock Rogers. She actually was a sharecropper as well, but she had the opportunity to go to college. She was going to Mary Allen School out in Texas. I can't remember quite where it's located, but it's a school for black women to become nurses. And she ended up having emergency surgery for appendectomy. She ended up having to use the money that she would have used for school to pay for the surgery, and she couldn't borrow any more money from the landowner that they were sharecropping from. So what happened is she became a maid for the rest of her life. She was maid for the rest of her life. I actually have her maid's uniform with the apron. I found that when we buried her in 2017. She refused to let my mother and her sister work. My mother is here. She graduated top of her class with a 4.0 valedictorian, got a full ride to the University of Oklahoma. Today, she still holds the highest test score on the physical therapy exam in the state. And her sister went on to become a top pharmacist in the Pharmaceutical Honor Society, and at age 50 went back to school and became an attorney. That's all from that woman. And so I am proud to stand here in front of you as the curator of African American Museum, the Slavery and Freedom Exhibition, an attorney, someone who graduated from Howard University because of all of these women. And guess what? They're all from Texas. So this is my cousin who came in from Ecuador and got to see her family. This is my father's family. This picture is from 1910. 10 years after they had moved to Indian Territory, after they had killed these Klan members. It's actually 20 years because they moved in 1890. And then I dedicate this to my father and my grandfather because a week ago my father passed away. I go to his funeral on Saturday. So I leave out of here tomorrow morning. This is my father, this is my grandfather. What they did every 2 years was we had our family reunions and we sat around in a circle. And in the middle of the circle, my grandfather sat with his sisters and they always told the family history every 2 years. And I never forgot it. And one of the things they shared was, our family was friends with Booker T. Washington. Well, I was a kid, I didn't know what that meant. But then one day I said, you know what, I heard our family was friends with Booker T. Washington. And my uncle said, we were. And Mary, would you please continue to do the research? He said that to me 2 days before he died, and I promised him I would. And so it's brought me to this. So I'm very honored to be able to share this story with you because all of us have these stories. All of us have these stories. So please keep digging, looking, and letting us know what this history is because the rest of the nation needs to know how deep our history goes in this nation. So thank you very much.
You know, this is everything that HMAC is about. And every February in Black History Month, we have people come over and talk about their stories. We have some folks who have taken, you'd never know this, but they've taken their history all the way back to the slave ship. Houstonians, just digging the one person who decides, I'm going to be the family historian. And one of the things that always amazed me, my dad would always say, my late dad would always say, he said, who are you with? I said, oh, I'm with Joe Rogers. He said, Joe Rogers? Is that Joe Rogers? I said, Dad, there are a lot of Joe Rogers all over the country. But the reality is, as time goes by, actually, there is the possibility that you run into this Joe Rogers. And the other thing that you discover, if you listen to these histories over and over and over again, there's just not one African-American family that does not have something very special about them, some ancestor, something about them. The issue is, do we capture it and do we keep it? And so it's very important for historians to do this. I'm also delighted about this talk because it so gets everything about HMAC. You know, we are the place that says we are, if you go outside and you look at the banner, on one side it says, lest we forget. That's John Hope Franklin's, I want to tell the unvarnished truth about what's going on. But the other side of it is, one history, one people, one nation, a common future. And you hit this, I mean, it is. And so finally, I'd be remiss to not acknowledge some things that happened. Why is this here? Well, there's Eileen Lawal in the back. And if it were not for Eileen, who's a former board member and who's with the Freedmen's Town Conservancy, who, when you stop and you look at the UNESCO slave project here, that those designations were made, that's because of the work of that woman right back there. And so I thank you for doing this, for bringing Mary to us. And I thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.
Can we ask questions?
Sure.
So what tools did you use to like research this? Like, did you? I know you travel a lot, but like, where did you start? Like, did you start with like Ancestry.com and was like?
Well, you know what? This is funny. I remember I kept getting all these news clippings from my aunts, and I have every 2 years we have our reunion. And I had an aunt who would always say, you know, there's the one family member who's like, okay, get the information on your family, what's going on right now, and then they compile it into a book. And I remember thinking, I don't have time for that. I got to get ready for finding a job. I'm graduating from college. I actually found the letter I wrote her but never sent. And so I kept all those pieces of paper. I just put them to the side. So whenever you hear something or something comes your way, put it to the side. You may not think anything of it, but one day you're going to look back. And I'll tell you what that means. My mother, when we cleaned out my grandmother's house, I saw all these funeral programs. And my mother kept saying, well, we don't need all those. We just need to keep the ones we know. But all I kept thinking was, no, you need to keep those. Because when you lay them out, you're going to find out that this person who has a different last name is actually your relative because of this marriage. She ended up getting rid of like half of them. And so she had to do the family history tree for this branch of the family. And I never forget, I didn't want to say to her, I told you so. But I wanted to say to her, I told you so. So I had taken a few pictures of some of those, and she was able to look at the pictures of some of those that she threw out, plus she had some that she had kept. So funeral programs, listening closely to what your elders say to you, even some of your younger relatives. Because sometimes those younger relatives are sitting around the older folks, and they're like, you know what Aunt so-and-so said to me? And you might take it for granted, but make a note, right? And then follow the breadcrumbs. For me, I followed the breadcrumbs for Booker T. Washington. I followed the breadcrumbs for, they kept sending me stuff on John Gandy. I was like, I don't know how this man's related. So I started researching John Gandy, and then I found that unpublished autobiography. They had sent me a few chapters, but I didn't know what it was. I was like, why are they giving me this? And then it made sense. Also, if you think, well, everyone's deceased, perhaps they are. But here's what we know. They went to church, they went to school, they lived somewhere. Okay, paid taxes. We drove into Mississippi. We didn't know anyone. We ended up meeting people who were our relatives. They were like, and they said really crazy, they were like, we knew we had, this is just, they're crazy. They were like, well, we knew we had some light-skinned cousins in Oklahoma. Like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But they were crazy. They were crazy. And the thing that's funny is my great-grandfather, he was the result of a rape, and he looked white. He looked white. If you see the pictures of him next to the rest of the community, and he hated that. And I remember as a kid hearing, he'd always say, I'm black, I'm black, I'm black. And I used to think, well, of course he's black, we're black. But then I saw a picture of him, and I realized what the deal was. And so the other thing he did was he made all his daughters marry dark-skinned men because he didn't want anyone to wonder that they were black. He was like, we're black, and that's it, right? So I just followed the breadcrumbs. The sources I used at the time, I was using Ancestry.com. I used Google. And this was 2000, early 2000. So all of that stuff didn't have everything that you see now. So you're fortunate now. If you go on, you'll find a lot more than you expect. And also look at the African American Historical and Genealogical Society. They do publications that a lot of people kind of disregard, but their publications are equivalent to a lot of scholarly journal writing. They really do dig and do scholarship work and bring forward primary source materials. So definitely check into that because they have chapters all over. So that's some of the places I would start. And travel to those places that you heard about. Yeah, go walk the landscape.
Did you mention a particular archive early as you began speaking?
I went to the Library of Congress for Booker T. Washington's manuscript collection. And then when John Gandy, when I found out that he was the president of Virginia State University, I called the archivist there. And you don't have to have a budget to travel. You can just call people. Now, I'll tell you what I did for Mississippi. I cold called people. I looked in the phone book for Elliott. And I was like, hi, my name's Mary Elliott. I'm looking for some relatives. And I met people. And when I got to Mississippi, I met them face to face. And they called up the person down the street, you know, Miss Mary's coming by and you need to talk to her. They'd have a whole dinner ready and sit down and talk to you about the churches, about the plantation sites. And even if it wasn't directly related to my family, it gave me more insight on this, on the place. So that was very important, to just go and be there. And people might say, well, but they're not talking about my family. You may not think so. But then when you get home and start looking through your notes, you might go, oh, wait, okay, now this makes sense. Yeah, so I looked at the archives. In this instance, I happen to have two very high-profile men. But if they weren't, Shiro, Texas, I'm going into the archives down in Grimes County, or, you know, out in the Shiro area, and start looking through those local libraries and seeing what they have.
Do you know the...
And this is the other thing I'll say. You can go on Ancestry.com and they'll have stuff, but the African American resources, don't overlook those. So look at your HBCUs. Look at a perfect example. The WPA narratives, those are where they, in the 1930s, the Work Progress Administration interviewed formerly enslaved African Americans. There's an edited voice when they were being interviewed because the interviewers were white. But there's a man at Southern University that was doing the similar interviews down in Louisiana and other areas. And he used his students who were black, and the voices were less edited. And so Southern just digitized those interviews. So check that out because it's really telling, even if it has nothing to do with your family, to get insight on the experiences of African Americans.
What are they called?
It's at Southern University. It's a slave, it's like oral histories. And there's a book called Black Roots by a genealogist called Tony Burrows. And in that book, the one thing he said is you can know your aunt, your uncle, your grandmother, but you need to know the history. So why did, on one census, you see 10 black men in Oktibbeha County, but then 10 years later they're not there, but then 10 years later they're back? Because they were going to lease out their labor in Yazoo County, which is on the other side of the state, so they could make some money, and then they came back. So know the history so you can understand certain migration patterns, things that were going on, whether there was an illness, an epidemic going on. Very important to understand all of that. Yeah. Any other questions?
How much have you did on Emmett J. Scott?
I haven't delved into Emmett J. Scott as much as I would like to, but I will tell you that it was telling because the whole roll of microfilm, everything was Emmett J. Scott and my uncle. And I remember thinking, well, who is Emmett J. Scott? and then yeah.
Here in Houston,
yes.
1973.
Yes, and he knew everybody. So where everyone talks about Booker T. Washington, Emmett J. Scott was the backbone that was coordinating everything. So there were letters where he talked about, okay, so you're planning the convention. My uncle planned the convention, the last convention that Booker T. Washington attended. It was in Muskogee. And it was supposed to be in Boley, Oklahoma. Yes. So it was supposed to be in Boley.
I'm from Hollywood Cemetery, and I have someone there that helped incorporate Boley.
Okay, so now here was the deal with Boley. So I'm looking through the letters, and I was like, well, what happened with Boley? And Booker T. Washington's writing this up. He's like, I don't care what these Negroes are doing. We're having this convention in Oklahoma, right? Well, what I found out was there was a white man and a black man, both preachers, who were pushing for black people to go back to Africa. And so there were two factions in Boley. One wanted to go, one didn't. And so they ended up moving the conference to Muskogee. Some of those people who thought they were going to Africa ended up in Philadelphia, and that's as far as they got. And so that's really telling in itself, because imagine looking at that strand of people who just got as far as Philadelphia. But so I have to do more research on Emmett J. Scott. I just know a few bits and pieces about him, but it's really important because Emmett J. Scott was coordinating when all that stuff was going on with Boley. He was orchestrating all of that and coordinating all these people across the nation. Yeah.
The heartwarming things that you do find out about your family just by looking at it, probably the most poignant part of my family history was when my dad died and I got his books, boxes of books. And I had an uncle who was part of the Great Migration from Texas to California. And we never knew anything about him because he left, went out there, and that was it. Never saw the guy at anything. And then when my dad died, I'm going through these books, and there are these letters from my uncle to here. And it really illuminated on human terms. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, there was the Great Migration, these people went there. It's another to have you looking at your uncle saying, I'm running out of money, can you help me? If I could get a car, I can do, it adds a whole totally different dimension to it. But anyway, we could go on and come back. We've got a full Black History Month. I want to again thank Eileen Lawal, thank Mary Elliott, thank all of you all for coming. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.